They fined me $10,000 for grass. Not a commercial property, not a football field, my front yard. And for what? A few blades standing taller than their approved height, in a place where rain was a blessing and weeds were warfare. That morning, as I held the cream-colored notice from the Oak Hollow HOA, I realized something deep in my bones. They weren't trying to enforce order. They were trying to erase me. My name is Jackson Maddox, and this isn't just about tall grass. It's about legacy. I live on a 20-acre ranch straddling the Texas-New Mexico border, land passed down from my grandfather, a war hero who returned home with medals in his drawer and dirt under his fingernails. He built the house with his own hands in the 1960s, back when this stretch of land was nothing but wilderness and wind. And now, 60 years later, a woman named Karen Harrington in pearl earrings and polished heels was trying to tell me I didn't belong here. She called herself the HOA president, but there'd never been a proper vote. She was simply the loudest voice in the room until everyone else fell silent. Her husband, Philip Harrington, owned a development company called Harrington Properties. Together, they had visions of turning the Lakeside Ridge into a gated resort complex, complete with heliport access and synthetic beaches. My land, especially the back 15 acres with unobstructed lakefront, was their crown jewel, and they would do anything to get it. The fines started a few months ago. First, $200 for excessively large American flag displays. Then $400 for unsightly vehicles, my pickup truck that still bore desert dust from my last volunteer mission helping tornado victims. Then came the military paraphernalia notice. Apparently, my grandfather's bronze memorial plaque clashed with community decorum. It wasn't about violations. It was a campaign of attrition. But $10,000? That crossed a line. I dropped the letter on the counter next to the others, dozens of them, each one signed by Karen's pristine cursive, as if it were a royal decree. I had ignored the early ones, thinking this would blow over like a spring storm. I was wrong. They weren't letting up. They were escalating. I poured a coffee and stared at the horizon where the late summer sun bathed the hills in gold. My eyes drifted toward the fence line where HOA boundaries ended. That's when it clicked. The HOA only had jurisdiction over the first 5 acres. The rest, 15 untouched, unrestricted acres, was a legal no-man's land, untouched by their bylaws and petty vendettas. That night, as I buried myself in county property records and digital archives, my suspicions took form. 3 years ago, the HOA map had been amended quietly to extend its reach. The amendment had no recorded vote, no unanimous approval, just a signature from Philip Harrington, stamped with some ambiguous clause about future expansion. It wasn't legal. It was a lie dressed up in bureaucracy. Then came a knock at the door. It was Mark Chin, a quiet science teacher who lived a few lots down, always polite, always cautious. "You got a minute, Jackson," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I invited him in. He didn't want coffee. He didn't sit. He just spoke. "At the last HOA meeting," he said, when they thought most of us had left, Karen said, and I quote, "We'll price Maddox out of his boots. He'll beg to sell before Thanksgiving." He looked sick just repeating it. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I stood in front of my barn, looking over that back stretch of land. The property line ran less than 1,000 feet from the Harrington mansion, where they hosted their lavish brunches, wine tastings, and charity galas. But there was something they hadn't considered, something written into Texas state law. Shooting ranges on private, unincorporated land were fully legal, and I just so happened to be a former Special Forces firearms instructor with a degree in property law and a Rolodex of veterans who owed me favors. They tried to drown me in fines and red tape, but they forgot who I was. I hadn't felt this alive since Kandahar, not in the sense of chaos or gunfire, but in the clarity that comes when someone draws a line in the sand and dares you to cross it. I wasn't a soldier anymore, but my instincts were intact. Karen and Philip Harrington thought they were playing a high-stakes game of real estate chess. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't a pawn. I'd always played long games, and I played to win. First order of business. I called Emily Rhodes, a longtime friend from law school who now specialized in property litigation. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. "You know," she said, after a long pause, "Philip tried this same play with my aunt's ranch in Navarro County. She took a settlement. You don't strike me as the settling type." "I'm not," I said. She laughed. "Good. Then let's burn this thing down, legally." Emily's first move was to obtain every document the HOA had filed in the last 5 years. What she found was a goldmine. Hidden amendments. Forged signatures. Bylaws changed without a single vote. And worst of all, the expansion of HOA jurisdiction onto lands that were legally outside their scope, including mine. But that wasn't the best part. Emily uncovered something buried in old environmental filings from Harrington Properties. Recycled environmental impact reports, the exact same wording, just with different locations and dates. One of the reports, used for a development in Hill County, had been previously flagged for manipulation. If we could prove they falsified the aquifer data under my land, we wouldn't just stall their project, we could kill it entirely. I don't just want to win, I told her. I want them to feel it. Emily's reply was cold steel. Then we go scorched earth. While Emily worked the legal angles, I began my own campaign. The first step was simple, but symbolic. I bought 40 bright orange boundary stakes and drove them into the ground around the 15 acres out back, each one marked with a laminated sign that read, "Future site of Maddox Tactical Range, opening soon." Right beneath that, I added, "Proudly outside HOA jurisdiction." It took less than 48 hours before I saw Karen's black Lexus creeping down the access road. Her expression twisted in silent rage as she scanned the land. I waved. She didn't wave back. The next day, I filed my business application with the county office. Maddox Tactical Range. The clerk raised her eyebrows as I handed over the form. "You planning to open a gun range?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said, with the calmness of a man planting roots. "Veteran-owned. Community-oriented. Fully compliant. Zoned AG?" she asked. I nodded. "And outside city limits." She whistled low. "Well then, good luck." While the permit processed, I didn't wait. I started clearing the land, legally. Brought in a backhoe. Had steel targets shipped from Utah. My friend Clay, a retired Navy corpsman, showed up unannounced with a trailer full of lumber and a grin on his face. "Figured you might need a hand," he said. Word spread fast among the veteran community. Within a week, I had half a dozen guys helping. Not just out of loyalty, but because they believed in what we were building. Not just a range, a sanctuary. But then came the pushback. A county road crew showed up unannounced and began placing barricades at the only paved entrance to my land. Signs reading "Road closed, maintenance." Except the county had no maintenance scheduled. I made one call to Sheriff Dean Holloway, a man who'd served with my grandfather decades ago. He didn't need much convincing. The crew was gone within the hour. "They're testing your resolve," he said. "Don't blink." Then came the article. Front page of the Oak Hollow Gazette. Local gun range sparks outrage among families, children at risk. The piece was riddled with quotes from anonymous residents expressing concern over militarization and declining property values. But the sources weren't so anonymous if you knew the board. Karen chaired half their committees. The next morning, I launched a website, www.hoanightmare.org. Simple, anonymous submission form. Tell us your HOA horror story. Within 72 hours, we had over 90 responses. Some funny, some heartbreaking, all revealing the same thing. The HOA had become a weapon. Karen had turned it into a kingdom, and people were ready to revolt. The final straw came 2 weeks later at an emergency HOA meeting Karen called. I wasn't technically required to attend, since the majority of my land wasn't under her rule. But I showed up anyway. She stood at the front of the room in a red power suit, arms crossed, glaring at me. "This so-called tactical range," she began, "poses a grave threat to our community. I am proposing a new bylaw to triple dues for properties engaged in activities that disrupt neighborhood harmony." I raised my hand. "I have something to share with the room," I said. Then I pulled out my phone, tapped a file, and held it to the mic. It was audio from the last meeting, captured when the room was nearly empty. Karen's voice, clear as a bell. "Let's squeeze Maddox until he sells. Nobody wants his kind ruining our community." The room erupted. Gasps. Shouting. Neighbors looking at each other in disbelief. Even those who hadn't taken sides before were suddenly seeing her for what she really was. Karen tried to backpedal. That was taken out of context. But the damage was done. Someone stood up. I moved to hold a vote of no confidence in Mrs. Harrington's leadership. Another added, seconded. Karen's face turned pale. Her lips moved, but no words came out. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched. This wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of it. The moment the vote passed to suspend Karen Harrington from the HOA board, I could almost hear a tectonic shift ripple through Oak Hollow. It wasn't just political. It was personal. For years, she'd operated unchecked, shaming families over mailbox colors, fining veterans over lawn ornaments, threatening retirees over unpaid dues. Now, with her credibility cracked in public, the facade was breaking faster than she could patch it. But I knew Karen well enough to understand one thing. She wouldn't go quietly. 2 days later, a surprise inspection notice was posted on my fence by the County Zoning and Development Authority, citing possible environmental disruption due to ongoing construction. I called Emily. She wasn't surprised. "Let me guess," she said, already typing furiously. "They're citing watershed concerns?" Bingo. That's Philip's play. It's what he uses when they can't outbid someone. Drag them into red tape and bleed them dry. She filed an emergency response within hours, attaching our documentation, permits, and even photos of the minimal soil disruption. But the real power move came next. Emily had discovered a pattern of recycled environmental impact reports used by Harrington Properties. Identical language, just different addresses. She called it what it was: fraud. We filed a formal complaint with the state environmental agency, attaching the duplicates side by side. And because Emily was thorough, she included a timeline showing how each false report had coincided with sudden HOA harassment in neighborhoods surrounding the proposed developments. It wasn't just happening to me. It was a system, a racket dressed up in bylaws. Meanwhile, the range was coming to life. We installed a modular safety barrier system, complete with berms and acoustic dampeners. Ryan, my old unit sniper and now a range safety officer, designed the shooting lanes with surgical precision. We held volunteer classes for veterans looking to recertify. Word of mouth was spreading, and interest from local law enforcement agencies started trickling in. They needed training grounds. We had space and integrity, but the Harringtons were losing patience. A week before our scheduled grand opening, I woke up to find road closed signs mysteriously reinstalled. But this time, they were cemented into the pavement and reinforced with barricades that clearly weren't DIY jobs. I called Sheriff Holloway. "I didn't authorize anything," he said, voice low. "Jackson, I'd keep someone at that gate overnight. I don't trust what they'll try next." He wasn't exaggerating. That Friday night, Clay caught 2 men snooping around the western perimeter. One had bolt cutters. The other carried what looked like a canister of industrial solvent. They scattered when he flashed his weapon and yelled, but not before one dropped a Harrington Estates-branded pin in the dirt. Still no solid proof. But the escalation was real. That night, I activated the last measure in my playbook, Operation Transparency. I'd been working with Mark Chun and a few other residents to build a coalition, unofficial at first, now growing into a movement. We called ourselves the Oak Hollow Alliance, and we made a promise: expose the truth, protect our neighbors, and restore sanity to our community. We planned a town hall-style meeting, independent of the HOA, hosted at the high school auditorium. We invited residents, media, and even county officials. Emily would present our legal findings. I'd present the human side, and Sheriff Holloway would make a surprise appearance to confirm the pattern of selective enforcement and suspicious connections. The flyer read, "Reclaim Oak Hollow. Learn the truth. Hear the voices. Say no to corruption, intimidation, and backroom deals. This community belongs to all of us." I expected 50 people, maybe 60. Over 300 showed up. The gym was standing room only, and dozens more lingered outside, listening through open windows. Emily went first, methodically laying out the forged signatures, falsified documents, and HOA boundary manipulations that had no legal standing. Then she dropped the bomb. Karen had altered HOA rules without board consensus, dozens of times. My part came next. I didn't talk law. I told stories. About veterans who'd been fined into foreclosure. About elderly couples who lived in fear of compliance patrols. About how my grandfather died thinking he'd secured our family's legacy, only for it to be threatened by cocktail-sipping tyrants in sun hats. Finally, we played the security footage of Karen screaming on my porch. "I'll bury you. I'll take everything from you. You'll wish you had sold." There was silence, then murmurs, then a wave of gasps. The audience erupted, not with rage, but with clarity. The myth of Karen Harrington, the benevolent HOA queen, was shattered. When the crowd calmed, a hand went up. It was Eleanor McKinley, one of the original founders of the Oak Hollow community, and a respected figure. I move we create an independent oversight committee to investigate all HOA activities going back 10 years, she said. Cheers followed. Someone else stood up. And we freeze all active HOA enforcement until then. More cheers. By the end of the night, Karen had been effectively excommunicated from the community she once ruled with a glittered iron fist. But I didn't go home celebrating, because I knew people like her didn't just retreat. They regrouped. And sure enough, I was right. At 3:07 a.m. the following morning, my motion sensor camera near the equipment shed triggered a silent alert. I opened my phone. 3 figures. Hooded. One with a gas can. One carrying what looked like a box with wires. I didn't hesitate. I texted the sheriff and grabbed my boots. By the time I reached the clearing, deputies were already arriving silently, coordinated through our newly formed alliance and our upgraded surveillance system. They caught 2 men red-handed, pouring accelerant near the wooden framework of our observation tower. The third, Karen Harrington herself, caught on camera, caught with intent, charged with conspiracy to commit arson, criminal trespassing, and attempted sabotage of a public facility. As she was placed in the back of the squad car, her eyes met mine. No tears, no apologies, just hatred and disbelief. She never thought we'd actually win. She was wrong. The morning after Karen's arrest felt still. The kind of stillness that sits over a battlefield just after the smoke clears, not peaceful, not calm, just an eerie, suspended breath. We weren't celebrating. Not yet. Not when the war was still being fought in courtrooms and county commission halls. But for the first time since this started, there was space to breathe. Karen's mugshot appeared in the Oak Hollow Chronicle by noon. The headline read, HOA president arrested in attempted arson scheme. Underneath, a subheading quoted the sheriff directly. She brought gasoline to a gun range. She didn't expect to meet law. The fallout was swift. Harrington Properties stock, already privately traded, dropped an internal valuation. The bank quietly froze a few accounts. And Philip Harrington, her husband, filed for divorce the same day, his lawyers leaking documents to suggest Karen had acted entirely on her own. But we knew better. Karen may have lit the match, but Philip laid the fuse. Emily and I spent the next few weeks turning over every rock tied to Harrington Properties, zoning loopholes, bribed inspections, falsified environmental reports. What emerged wasn't just one HOA president going rogue. It was an entire infrastructure of abuse, built quietly over a decade. Karen had used HOA bylaws as legal cudgels. Philip had used those cleaned-up neighborhoods to make sweetheart land deals. Their weapon of choice wasn't bulldozers. It was paperwork. And they both underestimated what happens when people fight back with facts, not fists. The grand opening of Maddox Tactical Range was rescheduled for the following Sunday. We didn't advertise. Didn't need to. Word had already spread through veterans organizations, sheriff's departments, and community groups. The local high school band offered to play. A barbecue pinmaster from the next town over volunteered to cook. We even had a color guard show up, American flags snapping in the wind against a bright, cloudless sky. At precisely 8 a.m., we fired the first round from the precision rifle lane, a ceremonial shot made by a 72-year-old Marine who'd lost a leg in Fallujah. The sound echoed across the lake, bouncing off the tile roofs of the luxury homes that once sent HOA letters for audible wind chimes. There were no complaints this time. Instead, people clapped. Some cried. By noon, families were signing up for safety classes. Retirees who had never handled a firearm were being trained by seasoned instructors. Local police departments and attendants booked regular slots. A few reporters even came, this time leaving with quotes from real residents, not Karen's cronies. Even those who'd once opposed the range were now shaking hands, eating pulled pork, and saying things like, maybe this is what we needed all along. But not everyone had moved on. The legal battle continued in the background. Emily worked with the state's Attorney General's office after our formal complaints triggered an investigation into nonprofit abuses, fraudulent zoning changes, and unauthorized changes to HOA governance. The surprise twist? A whistleblower from Harrington Properties came forward. An assistant accountant named Luis emailed us anonymously at first, then agreed to meet. Nervous, fidgety, but holding a flash drive like it was nuclear launch codes. What was on it? Dozens of internal memos from Karen and Philip, detailing not only plans to seize key lakefront parcels but also coordination with county assessors to manipulate property valuations. lowering assessments on their allies and inflating them on holdouts like me. I wanted to come forward earlier, Louise said, but she had people watching everyone. I'm done being afraid. Emily gripped the drive like a sword hilt. With this, they're finished. We packaged the data with our existing file and delivered it to the district attorney's office. They didn't just open a case. They formed a task force. And suddenly, Oak Hollow wasn't just a sleepy HOA town anymore. It was the center of a statewide corruption probe. In the weeks that followed, we saw the results of our stand ripple outward. The HOA board was dissolved and replaced by a resident-led coalition, with Mark Chin voted in unanimously as chair. Karen's frozen assets were partially seized to pay restitution, a portion of which funded veteran housing initiatives. Philip, in a last-ditch PR move, offered to donate land to a county environmental trust to avoid deeper litigation. And as for the aquifer beneath my land, the very reason this war began, it was placed under permanent conservation easement, accessible to the community but untouchable by developers. I remember the day the conservation papers were signed. Emily and I stood at the edge of the lake, the same lake Karen once dreamed of monopolizing, and we just watched the water. All this, I said, because I didn't mow my lawn on time. Emily laughed. Nah, all this because you stood your ground. That night, we held a small get-together at the range. Veterans, teachers, families, survivors of HOA harassment who had nearly given up. We raised a toast, not just to victory, but to resilience. As the sun dipped below the Texas hills, the sky blazed in oranges and reds, and you could still hear the echo of a few shots in the distance. Not in anger, not in vengeance, just the rhythmic, steady crack of freedom finding its voice again. But just when I thought it was over, a certified envelope arrived in the mail. Return address, Harrington Legal Group. Inside, a single-page statement. Karen Harrington intends to challenge her conviction and sue for defamation, emotional distress, and wrongful public targeting. No signature, just a stamped seal. I stared at it for a long moment, then smiled. Let her try. Because this time, the community was ready. Karen Harrington's attempt at a legal comeback was like a final gasp from a storm already spent, loud, erratic, but ultimately powerless. Her lawsuit was meant to intimidate, a volley of accusations wrapped in legal jargon and delivered with the false confidence of someone who still believed their name meant something. But Oak Hollow had changed, and this time, she stood alone. The community she once dominated now stood unified, not in hatred, but in resolve. Her lawsuit, alleging defamation, emotional distress, and targeted harassment, was met with a swift motion to dismiss, led by Emily and supported by affidavits from over 120 residents, each detailing years of arbitrary fines, intimidation, and rule-bending under her leadership. We didn't respond to her lawsuit with fear. We responded with documentation, footage, timelines, and truth. And when the judge threw out her civil suit as without merit and bordering on frivolous, her final move was to retreat entirely from Oak Hollow, from the HOA, and from public life. Her mansion was listed quietly. No photos. No tours. Sold off in a sealed auction. The buyer? A nonprofit I helped found with Emily and Sheriff Holloway, the Legacy Project, dedicated to supporting veterans' access to property ownership. It was poetic. The house she once ruled from now served as an operations base for a mission far greater than her failed empire, one focused on healing, empowerment, and ensuring no one else would be driven out of their home for simply flying a flag or letting their grass grow too tall. Meanwhile, Maddox's tactical range didn't just survive. It flourished. We expanded to include a women's self-defense program taught by former law enforcement officers, a scholarship-based youth firearms safety program to teach respect, not fear, therapeutic sessions for combat veterans, including archery and open sky training to combat PTSD. By the 6-month mark, we were booked 3 months out. Families visited. Veterans found purpose. Local police trained alongside civilians. It wasn't just a business. It was a beacon. The community, once fractured by fear and HOA tyranny, had healed into something better, stronger. People planted gardens without waiting for permission. Neighbors helped neighbors instead of reporting them. The HOA, restructured under Mark Chin's leadership, became what it should have always been, a support system, not a surveillance state. And as for me, well, I never wanted to be a symbol. But sometimes, standing your ground makes you one. I still remember the last conversation I had with Emily before she left town to open a new branch of her practice. We stood on the hill behind the range, looking out over the lake as the wind stirred the tall grass. Grass I'd never bother mowing down to regulation again. You know, she said, this could have gone 100 different ways. Yeah, I replied, but I'm glad it went this way. You turned a war into a movement. I shook my head. No, I just refused to be bullied. Everyone else made it a movement. She nodded. Then let it keep moving. That was the lesson. Karen Harrington had believed in exclusivity, power, and control. But she underestimated the power of something far stronger. A community that wakes up. A few months later, her criminal trial began. Though she had hired a new, high-profile legal team and tried to present herself as misunderstood, the evidence was overwhelming. The attempted arson, the HOA manipulation, the forged documents, all tied together by her own voice, her own emails, and her own recklessness. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in a correctional facility, with 2 years suspended and mandatory community restitution, including service hours and financial reparation to homeowners she had targeted. But what stung her most wasn't the sentence, it was the public reading of resident testimonials, each detailing the damage her reign had caused. When she was escorted out of the courtroom in cuffs, she didn't look at anyone. But everyone looked at her. And for once, they didn't look away. Today, Oak Hollow stands as a quiet revolution. Where once there was fear, now there is pride. Where once a single woman could dictate the aesthetics of patriotism, now flags fly freely. Children draw chalk dragons on sidewalks without citations. And neighbors greet each other not with suspicion, but with genuine connection. The HOA's official motto was changed this year. It used to be, preserving property, preserving peace. Now, it reads, united by community, protected by truth. I framed the final letter from the HOA, the one canceling all prior violations against me, and hung it in the lodge by the firing lanes, right next to a bronze plaque honoring my grandfather. To those who stood and still stand. And every Sunday morning at exactly 8 a.m., the sound of the first shot rings out over the hills. Not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as a reminder that freedom doesn't live in silence. It lives in the voices that won't be quieted, in the truths that won't be buried, in the people who won't be moved unless they choose to move. Karen Harrington hated that sound. Now, she gets to hear it echo from history, knowing she was the reason it rings louder than ever. And if you're reading this, wondering whether to fight back against the injustice in your neighborhood, your community, or your life, just remember, sometimes the best defense isn't defense at all. It's knowing exactly where to build the firing line.